So while the last few take their seats and make themselves comfortable, let me welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to the Arts of Resistance Festival. Give it up. More. Come on. A little more, just a little more. All right. My name is Ali Al-Jabiri. I'm honored to be your host tonight. We have a brilliant program. We'll start with a talk show-like setting, talking to a number of fantastic artists whom I'll introduce to you later on from the Dutch scene. The interviews will be interrupted by, of course, music. Then we'll have a one-on-one interview with our guests from London. And I'm sure you know his name, so I won't mention it now. And after that, we'll have some time for Q&A with all the artists who participated today. And then we'll continue with the rest of the musical program. How about we kick off with the first musical performance? Yes? So welcome to the States. Not the States. That's a very wrong word to say here. Welcome to the stage, June, Michi, and Marikid. Give them an applause.
The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated.
The people united will never be defeated. Makibaka, huwag matakot. These two protest slogans reflect the political struggles of the working people of the world. The first one, the people united will never be defeated, is an adaptation of El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, made popular by Quilapayún, Sergio Ortega, and Victor Jara from Chile. Makibaka, huwag matakot is a slogan from the 1960s during the youth demonstrations against the Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos. In English, it would translate literally to dare to unite in struggle. Do not be afraid.
Tonight, we stand here to open the festival about arts of resistance. Allow us to take the opportunity to give tribute to all martyrs of resistance and revolutionary movements in the history of humanity. And finally, allow us to air out call for solidarity for the Philippine revolutionary movement. In behalf of the Filipino people in struggle for genuine democracy, for national and social liberation, against the tyrannical dictatorship of Rodrigo Duterte, we ask you, we challenge you, we appeal for your support.
This guitar that we will use is a tribute to Victor Jara, a Chilean musician, songwriter, theater artist who was murdered during a 1973 US-sponsored coup that toppled the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. A year earlier, in September 1972, the Philippines was also placed under a military dictatorship by Ferdinand Marcos. We share the same history with Chile. Since then, the oppression and exploitation of the working people continue to intensify as capitalism thrashes about and screams violently as it refuses to die.
A letter to Victor Jara. Happy birthday, dearest comrade Victor Jara. You would have been 89 years old today had they not broken your fingers and snuffed the breath out of your life 49 years ago. A few days ago, two comrades of ours were murdered by the fascist Duterte regime in the Philippines. Comrades Part Bagani and Karima Lorena Tariman. Comrade Parts Bagani was a Red Warrior who was a prolific visual artist, illustrator. His works remind us of the bright murals of the Ramona Para Brigade in Chile. When he was killed by the fascist agents, he did not have guns, but he had his pencils, pens, brushes, and paints to fight back with. Comrade Karima was an outstanding poet, a storyteller, and a theater artist. She joined the People's Army when she finally came to terms with what makibaka huwag matakot really means. Comrade Victor, you said you had to make music because it made sense and reason. This is so true. We believe Comrade Parts and Karima, like thousands, and all the genuinely committed revolutionaries and activists realize what it truly means. It means committing their lives to serving the people, the poorest, most oppressed in society, poor peasants, striking workers, indigenous people, and embracing their struggle to change society, to transform the world. It means giving up the comforts of middle-class life. It means prioritizing serving the people over and above your own family, loved ones, and friends. It means spending less time with them, stretching your already tight family budget. Because activist work, serving the people, and fighting dictators, they're not paid jobs. It places your own life and welfare at risk. You will have to face the constant threat of surveillance, harassment, arrest, detention, torture, and forced disappearance, and even murder. It also means risking the lives and welfare of your loved ones because the reactionary and fascist state will use all its power and might to crush those who dare speak and challenge its rule. For the fascists, our families, loved ones, and friends, they count merely as collateral damage. We listen to your manifesto often because it reminds us why we make art and music and love singing the songs inspired by Canción Nueva and our own mga awit na revolutionaryong Pilipino. And like you, we do not sing just to sing, and certainly not because we have a good voice or play the guitar like gods. Like you, we sing because this guitar, this very guitar that we named Victor, this guitar makes sense, and like you say, it has reason and sense. This guitar named Victor has a heart and body made of wood, stained with many shades of sienna, the color of soil, of earth, of the sunburnt hide on the backs of those who toil in the rice fields and work in construction sites. This guitar named Victor was about to thrown away, but it called to us like salt water of oceans that separate millions and millions of migrants from their lovers, their children, and their families and friends. Now, it sings notes that tell about tiempos muertos, the seasons of death, and the bittersweet taste of sugar produced by slave workers in the plantations of Escalante in the Philippines. From this guitar we named Victor, comes melodies, beats, rhythms of glories and sadness, of dreams and aspirations, the chorus of generations of workers and peasants, dead and living, young and old, struggling to be free. This guitar doesn't belong to the landlords and capitalists, and certainly not to their goons, their filthy police, and sadistic military agents. It will always be a weapon in the hands of those who crave for genuine revolutionary change. And because this guitar named Victor shall accompany our spoken words to reach the heavens, the aspiration of the people united, because we will never be defeated. Because our song does make sense, revolutionary sense, and our hearts and arteries do beat with reason, revolutionary reason, in sync with those who die, singing the bitter truth and the hope of freedom, rather than the dirges of sweetened lies, masking putrid imaginings of any fascist regime. Here and now, as it was then, and as it will be, where everything begins and where everything comes together, our song that has been relentless, brave, and undaunted, our song will always remain our Canción Nueva, ang bagong awit, our new song. The people united will never, ever be defeated. Makibaka, huwag matakot.
Makibaka, wag matakot! Makibaka, wag matakot! Join us! The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated.
Bangon bayan, tayo'y magwawagi. Abot tanaw, ang bagong araw. Puso diwa ng bayang ginusta. Sumisigaw ng basya at paglaya ng bayang api.
Walang katarungan, daang taon, hawak ng dayuhan.
Sulong bayan, tayo'y magwawagi.
Ating
Yaman, laging ipaglaban. Lupa, langit, dagat, kabundukan. Nasa kamay ng mga dayuhang mapang-api.
ganit,
Mapagsamantala, kapit, bisig, hindi malulupig. Sumulong kabayan, tayo ngayon'y lalaban. Ubos lakas ang siling, isisigaw ang sulong.
The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. United will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated.
Sulong bayan, tayo'y magwawagi. Ipaglaban ating karapatan. Hilag at timog, silang at kanluran.
Bawat sulok ng bayay nagkakaisang tunay. Ang buong kapuluan, kapit-pisig, hindi malulupig. Bangon sulong, bayay magwawagi. Sabay-sabay, sigaw ng tagumpay. Lunsod, baryo, eskwela at pabrika. Ihuhudyat, sigaw ng kalayaan ng bayang may apoy. Sa diwa at dibdib, kapit-pisig, hindi malulupig. Sumulong kabayan, tayo ngayon'y lalaban. Ubod lakas ang tinig, isisigaw ang sulong. The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
Makibaka, huwag matakot.
Long live international solidarity! Long live! Yeah, long live international solidarity! Thank you. Thank you.
No, keep it rolling. Michi, Marikit, and June. Let me ask the other two guests who are part of the panel to come forward. Let me introduce to you Pravini,
Yes.
an artist and activist. Give her an applause.
Thank you.
And next to her sitting Chihiro, also artist and an activist. I'm sure you guessed. So we'll have a chat of about 10 minutes, then we'll have another musical interlude. June, last time we met was about... Use the microphone if you want. 5,
Super
6,
long time ago.
7,
Maybe 8 years
maybe
ago.
8. Do you ever get older?
I feel old. I feel like it's time to pass on the flame to the younger people now. I see a lot of them here.
Right. That very fantastic young lady singing with you is who? You have to say Michi.
Yeah, she's my partner, my comrade, my collaborator in art, and yeah, fellow revolutionary, my comrade.
And the other fantastic young one is?
Yeah, she's my baby. She's the younger of four. She's the youngest of four, and she's really grown to be a person that I have to be proud of, like my comrade as well, Marikit.
June, a question that came to my mind when I saw the fire in your voice. How do you do it?
That's a huge question. It'll take forever to answer. But I think you have to, like what I said in the piece, you have to commit yourself. You have to realize why you want to do it, because the cost of being an activist is so huge that it can cost your own life. It will affect the lives of the people around you, your family, your friends, your parents, or your grandparents, and the children as well, the grandchildren, my grandchildren. I do it because I want a better world for my grandchild, the little boy. See,
Right in the back, by the way, is his grandchild. Revolution is a family affair.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And it's for them. I thought it was for me, but when I had children, I realized that it was all for them. And then when I had grandchildren, I thought, it's not for us or my children. It's the future generations, you know. I'll probably never, ever see the fruits of this struggle. We will probably never see it. But the future generations, they're depending on us. If we don't do it now, there's big trouble ahead.
Thanks, June. Let me switch to my friend Pravini. Pravini, you also very recently were blessed with a child.
Yes.
You also, coincidentally, I know your father as well. You come from quite a revolutionary family. Can you compare the situation before you had a child? You were an activist then already. And the situation after having a child. In both cases, you were activist and artist. But then there was a child. How does that change things?
Yeah, I really recognize what June said. You understand that the struggle is not for you, it's for future generations. So everything that you do it because of your children. And you know, you have children, like biological children, but you also have, you know, collective children as a community. And having a child, you know, it feels more close, but in the end, even if I didn't have children, I would feel the same, that it's for future generations.
Do your songs feel like children?
I used to think so until I had children.
Chihiro, also a warm welcome to you. What is your, let me say, source of inspiration, musically speaking?
Okay, I was just about to say, I don't have any children. Yeah, so let me just first say, because of this conversation, I think what has brought me to the struggle has been more an ancestral call, a call for 500 years that need healing. And so I am a climate justice activist, and often there's the rhetoric of doing it for the future, and I have a little bit of allergies towards that. I'm very, I love this intergenerational and paying it forward, and we do need to, you know, be good caretakers in kinship and family. But for me, it's an ancestral thing, and I think musically, one of my inspirations in terms of resistance music is Immortal Technique. And one song...
The rapper?
The rapper, yeah. And one...
Let me just check, temperature check. Who doesn't know? No. Who knows Immortal Technique? Let's just check the... All right. So who doesn't know Immortal Technique? Only a few. All right,
You
all right.
quiet people.
All right, don't worry about it.
No
so
worries.
this is also an evening of being inspired to discover more.
Yeah. So I think one of the
So
things.
who's Immortal Technique? Tell them.
Yeah. So one of the things that was kind of generic is that he's half Peruvian, or he's got Peruvian ancestry. I'm half Bolivian, half Dutch, and in the Netherlands, the only representation of the whole continent of indigenous people was Pocahontas when I grew up. So I always got, because of my braids, Pocahontas, and I was just hungry to know that we're not extinct, and there's like a whole modern revolutionary spirit, which I found in Immortal Technique, and also one song in particular, "Poverty of Philosophy," is just really a good way to recharge your spirit. I think music kind of speaks to the base chakra of like survival, intuition, and stability where there is none. So if you can charge there from that root, you feel more alive and less extinct and less destabilized by political corruption. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Right. That's a lot to think about. Pravini, take us to your musical roots as an artist.
Yes, so I was, just to give you some context, I was born and raised in the Netherlands from Surinamese parents with, Indian ancestors. Indian as in East Asia, just to contextualize. And I started out as, just an average youngster of color, growing up in the West, listening to R&B, listening to hip-hop, listening to pop, and trying to do what you want to do in terms of music, And then as I started growing older and trying to take music to a professional level, you encounter all these challenges as a woman of color with, a message. I wasn't necessarily political then, but then there was a turning point in the Netherlands that forced everyone to take a stand, and that was the Zwarte Piet discussion. You had to show where you stand.
So Zwarte Piet is the Dutch blackface tradition, where, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe you should explain in 2 seconds.
It's blackface considered as an innocent children's tradition, but it's institutionalized form of blackface because you can't escape it. It's part of the educational system, of media, of commercial institutions, etc. And there were 2 artists. So again, art was the catalyst for that whole discussion that said Zwarte Piet equals racism, and that was it blew up in the Netherlands because it was the first time that racism was connected to what a lot of people felt like was an innocent children's celebration. But for me, as an artist, that was the turning point where, when people ask your opinion, do you keep quiet because you don't want to lose your commercial appeal, because that was the consequence? Or do you speak up and actually lose commercial appeal? So for an artist trying to make it, commercially, that was a dilemma. And for me, that was, a turning point where I said, well, I don't want to hide my political views. And in fact, I think this is actually something that I need to do. So before that point, I always treated art, as the goal, the end goal. And from that point on, I was like, no, wait, art is the means, and the end goal is liberation, right? So then art becomes a tool, and then it's not just music. It can be film, it can be, spoken word, it can be anything. So for me, that was my evolution as an artist, where initially I thought I was an artist with a political voice, and now I understand I'm an activist doing art.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah. June, back to you. We got a little context, well, a lot of context in a little time, from Chihiro and from Pravini about some of the struggles that they're involved in. Your struggle has the Philippines as the central location.
Yes.
I probably am not the only one who would have to say I know very little about the Philippines. Could you give us an idea about how that struggle looks like, what it is against?
Okay. most of you would probably know the Philippines from Marcos, the dictatorship of Marcos back in the 70s, 80s. The people rose up in 86 and overthrew the Marcos regime, and you'd probably have seen the 3,000 shoes of Imelda. No? And with that, and also the tourism blurbs, 7,000 islands, beautiful beaches, friendly people, there is a civil war going on in the Philippines. It's just really a struggle, a life and death struggle for many people. It's a struggle of mostly farmers, no? Trying to acquire the right to the land that they are tilling. 70% of the 12 million population of the Philippines are tied to the land and are struggling to survive. Our poor peasants barely eat at all during a day. Maybe once is a regular thing, twice would be lucky. And they produce, ironically, the food. And this is something that's happening in many countries in the world. And we struggled for more than 300 years to free ourselves from the Spanish colonial rule. But before we could win, we were almost there. We were sold to the United States for $20 million. And then that started our short history of being a formal colony of the United States.
And this is in what year?
Yeah, and then...
In which year is this, June?
1898, we were sold in the Treaty of Paris. And in the 1940s, just before World War II, the United States promised that we would be free. Then the war happened. We were under Japan for 5 years. And then in 46, our country was declared independence. But it wasn't real independence. For the next, until now, since 46, we are a neo-colony of the United States, primarily of the United States. It dictates over our economy, our culture, our society, over politics. And the dream of the Filipino people is to become a sovereign state, a free country, where we could develop ourselves for the people. But our agriculture, it's mainly an agricultural country, is still backward. We were using carabaos. We're using technology that was being used in Mesopotamia like thousands of years ago. When the carabao is sick, the wife pulls the plow. Sometimes the children pull the plow. The grandparents pull the plow. Okay. And it's horrible. It's really horrible. Now we have a president, Duterte. He's crazy. He has this notion of a war against drugs. In the 5 years that he has been in power, he has killed 30,000 people, mostly innocent people, maybe drug users, small-time users. But drug pushers or the drug syndicates, they were friends.
Is he still backed by the
Duterte.
United States? The current president is backed by the United States?
Yes, he's backed by the United States, and also he's very friendly with China. So that's one of our biggest problems, the imperialist intervention, primarily the United States, but also emerging China. And they're cooperating with the landlords, the big landlords and the businessmen. And the government is used as a business. So
we'll get back to this.
Up. Yeah.
To summarize. Brilliant. We'll get back to this. Right after the following song, we started this panel talking about children, and the next song by Pravini is called Children of the Revolution. And I think you have two other brilliant artists joining us on stage. Can I ask you, June and Chihiro, to make some space for Pravini? And when the two of them sit down, you time your applause, okay?
And while they set up, I just want to introduce the song. It's part of a music documentary, The Uprising, that tells the story of resistance from a decolonial perspective. And Chihiro already mentioned that we're in a 500-year struggle. So Children of the Revolution is about this intergenerational approach, the awareness that we're not the first ones in the struggle and we won't be the last, but we're all children of the revolution. We carry on the fight and we do our part in our lifetime. And this is a celebration of the strength of the ancestors because it's hard. So how do you keep going? For me, it's knowing that we're part of something bigger and that we carry on the flame, as June mentioned. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You can sing along. Whoa, 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 Can you hear us calling? We're looking for the strength of your soul. We need your spirit and wisdom and guidance. After pushback has taken its toll, show us the meaning of unbreakable. 'Cause giving up isn't an option when the conquest is the status quo. We are children of the revolution. Yes, the battle is all that we know. We continue to seek liberation with dignity and full of hope until the empire falls, empire falls, empire falls. Until the empire falls, empire falls, empire falls. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. We gave your bodies back to earth, but we carry the memories with us. We'll always remember the price you have paid and never forget the dilemmas you faced. They won't be in vain, your vision remains. So we won't move forward, 'cause giving up isn't an option when the conquest is the status quo. We are children of the revolution. Yes, the battle is all that we know. We continue to seek liberation with dignity and full of hope until the empire falls, empire falls, empire falls. Until the empire falls, empire falls, empire falls. Whoa, 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 whoa. Come on, sing along. Whoa, 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 whoa. We're gonna do the hook one last time, and I hope you sing along with me. Are you ready? Are you ready? Come on! Giving up isn't an option when the conquest is the status quo. We are children of the revolution. Yes, the battle is all that we know. We continue to seek liberation with dignity and full of hope until the empire falls, empire falls, empire falls. Until the empire falls, empire falls. Sing it! Until the empire falls. What? Until the empire falls, empire falls, empire falls. 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 Thank you. Thank you, Afro Grooves.
Bravini, ladies and gentlemen. She was playing with the band of Afro Grooves, who will also be closing the evening. So give them an introductory applause if you want. Let me also mention that tonight's event is brought to you and organized by Arales, Afro Grooves, Afrispectives, and Studio K. And it's supported by Stadsdeel Oost and AFK, het Amsterdams Fonds voor de Cultuur. Let's give the organizers an applause as well. How about that? Let's stick with Pravini, I'm sure you don't mind, for a bit more. This song is part of your
Music documentary.
music documentary
Yes.
and album.
Yes.
Yeah? Tell us about it. And also tell us how, I'm sorry to use the word, how it has tangibly contributed to the struggle.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I'm an artist, and I went into the studio with the band to write new songs. And as I was writing, I realized that the songs were really a reflection of the work that I did within the movement, and that all the songs were connected. So usually, you have a song and then it tells its own story. But then I felt like, no, these are songs that are really, really connected and are part of a bigger story. And while writing the songs, I saw images in my head, and I heard people speaking that explained theories. So I felt like this is actually a film. And I interviewed the people, and I connected the interviews with the songs. And that's how it happened. I have a slight throat issue here.
Take your time.
It's not corona. So I have to take a sip.
Take your
and come
time,
Back
take
to
your
you. So yeah, I ended up making the film, and it has been completely ignored by mainstream media and completely embraced by the movement, which is amazing. That's why I did it. I mean, it shows that the commercial appeal means nothing if it's not for the people.
I'm recalling this this line from, I think it's Stickman from Dead Press. Give it up for Dead Press. All right. I can't pull this off very often, so I'm real sorry that I'm doing this. Which is like, they never play my stuff on the radio, but I don't care. The enemy's supposed to hate it.
Yeah.
Reflect.
Yeah, because the revolution is never televised. And, I think this is the beauty also of the era that we live in. We create our own platforms, we create our own stages. And it's now being democratized by, social media. And the fact that we have this stage right here celebrating our stories just shows how powerful that can be.
I'll help you save your voice. That's very important. And give a turn to Chihiro. Chihiro, later you'll play for us a song called Shell Must Fall, which is also not just a song. It's part of something that effectively and tangibly contributes to change. Could you tell us about it?
Sure, yeah. So I think it started with the anti-racist march that we have each year. And being part of the movement, and when I say the movement, I mean both anti-war, climate, anti-racism, feminism, Free Palestine, and the whole shebang for liberation. I felt we needed a climate block at the anti-racism because people didn't really make that connection much of how the climate crisis is a colonial crisis, is a racist crisis. And so in the organizing of this block, of pushing like 100 green orgs to contribute to this block, I came up with a slogan, a whole bunch of slogans. One of them was, they raped and tortured and murdered for oil. Ogoni people not forgotten, shall must fall, shall must fall, shall must fall, shall must fall. And people really joined in. It was born in the march. And from this march, there was talk in Code Rood, an activist climate group, that we should start a campaign, Shell Must Fall. And before I knew it, I wasn't even part of the action conference. there was a big plan to block their AGM of Shell. And fast forward, I ended up making a song. So also in our international collaborations, because it's a collaboration campaign, people could join in to not just make the argument for Shell to fall because they make a lot of fossil fuels and fuck up the atmosphere, but that there's a lot of human rights and that their primary resources or their wealth was accumulated in colonization in Indonesia, and that we need to hear about the stories in Mapuche land, in Argentina, or in Nigeria, and it's a call for human rights. So that we anchored in the song. And when I say we, I'm talking about Florian. Florian, some of you might also know, he's the kind of, I don't know, maybe like the Jack Johnson of the climate movement, humming friendly climate songs. And he came to me, said, it would be cool to do a collaboration. So I wrote the lyrics based on that hook, and he arranged the music.
Brilliant. We'll be listening to that in a bit. June, you work with, and I apologize for mispronouncing, probably Linangan.
Linangan.
Exactly that. Foundation in the Philippines. Can you tell us about that work and how culture ties in?
It's actually a foundation based here in the Netherlands. And our objective is to try to uplift the lives and health of marginalized sectors in the Philippines. It's largely influenced by the advocacy of Willem Geertman. He's a Dutch development worker who went to the Philippines back in the 70s, and he lived there for 30 years. And he was working with the indigenous peoples, with farmers, with workers, trying to improve their lives. But in 2012, he was murdered. And people think that it was because he sided with the poor that he was murdered. So we renamed our foundation into the Linangan Willem Geertman Art and Culture Network. And with that, we sort of reformulated our goal. And this is to use art and culture as a way to raise the political consciousness of people about what's going on in the Philippines. So we try to mobilize creatives and artists, and doesn't have to be professional. It could be just people who want to do something important for the Philippines. And we have three distinct goals. The first is to portray the sufferings of the people, to portray the resistance, the brave resistance of the people against the exploitation and oppression that they are suffering from. And the third is to show a revolutionary future, the imaginings. It's important to have an aspiration. You can't just be resisting. You have to have a goal. And that's the only way that you can improve the lives of the people. And we try to support the cause of peasants and workers. And we want a democracy that's where they play a role in decision making, where they are in power.
Thanks, June. As we speak, you see images. So let me take an opportunity to also give a shout out to the visual and audio team. They're also recording, by the way. Give them a nice applause. If it's okay with you, I will maybe ask you a question that sounds strange coming from me, but it is a question that might be on the minds of many people who are not familiar with all of this, who probably have never heard of Victor Jara, Fela Kuti, Mercedes Sosa, whoever, let alone of Pravini, Chihiro, and June. All of these things that you're mentioning, challenging climate change, feminism, anti-racism, everyone agrees about that, right? Isn't the government also doing its best to counter these things and do good? Why do you pretend that you're on the fringes? Everyone agrees with you.
Who wants to go first?
Who wants to take a punch first?
Yeah, we need to go toe to toe with fighting oppression and exploitation. We don't have to take compromises. I mean, for the longest time, the oppressed people have been dehumanized, you know. They're treated not like people, they're commodities, they're objects. They're exploited to the bone. They hunger, they suffer, their children are sick. Most of the children in countries like the Philippines are malnourished, undernourished, undereducated. They don't go to school. People are unable to go to doctors. I know I've met people who have never, ever seen doctors in their lives. And this is not by accident. This is because this is the world order. There are strong countries that are taking advantage of the smaller countries, the weaker ones.
The Netherlands?
In the Netherlands, including, you know, they're part of this big machine. The Philippines, we're an export-oriented, import-dependent country. We export all our natural resources. We could have used that for our development, but we don't have industries. We are denied the opportunity to develop our industries. So our workers don't have jobs, so they migrate to other countries. They're here in the Netherlands cleaning toilets, they're cleaning homes, because they can't even feed their children at home, let alone send them to school.
Thanks.
So this is the order that we need to really go toe with, you know. Let's not pull punches anymore.
There's so many ways to answer it, so I'm like going through my head which ones I'm going to use. But let me start very specific with the Netherlands. Recently, I think in this year, last year, during COVID, Sint Maarten made a complaint about systemic racism of the Netherlands state. And the first thing they did was cut it of 18 million in its budget to not even... to just penalize financially. Talk about Bonaire, like they were annexed illegally in this colonial system. They're supposed to have had a referendum, but they never voted to become a municipality of the Netherlands. They voted for a lasso directo, like a direct link. And the Netherlands just interpreted like, okay, we'll annex it as a municipality. And talk about Indonesia, like when did they see reparations for the massive exploitation? Talk about Iraq, an illegal war where the Netherlands participated. I think it's really important. And who went to jail for that, by the way, of the state? Rutte, our prime minister, was already found guilty of racism in 2007 by court, and that's super hard to do. And he's still our prime minister, and has fallen with his cabinet again, and is still there. So I think what is really important, this is where I'll hand it over to Pravini, is that we have a problem that we don't understand that racism comes from the state. And the state has marketing to make it appear like it's a thing that happens on the street and not something that happens by the state. And I think you are very good at pointing out the difference between diversity and decolonization. So that's where I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah,
And right
you.
after Pravini finishes, we'll hand over the mic to you for your brilliant song, just so you know.
Yeah, I think this is part of the tactics, of oppression, is to tell a story that is false and then act like there's no problem. And I think it's up to us to challenge that story. And one of the stories is that racism is something individual. Well, indeed, it's a state institutionalized problem. And also a lot of things that, we talk about racism and discrimination, and people then tend to focus on discrimination and don't really understand the difference that discrimination is, the treatment of people and making a distinction that is irrelevant, while racism is an ideology that, links some people as superior and others as inferior. And a lot of people say, well, discrimination is against the law, and indeed it is, but racism isn't. Discrimination is mentioned in the law, but racism isn't, because it's an ideology. And I think that is the biggest struggle, is to challenge those ideas. It's not really about how we treat each other, it's about the images that we have. And the image that the Netherlands has is we're all, tolerant and very inclusive. when really, it's a very selective memory in that sense. So, and I think that's what we try to do every day, is to challenge those narratives and to bring those stories to the forefront. And I think, the stories like Zwarte Piet, but also, the recent, what's the word in English? The toeslagenschandaal? The tax scandal was because people demanded to have those stories seen. And I think that is, maybe also a good bridge to the next song, because we want to show how Shell has, violated human rights, and that is through art, the story that we tell.
For now, give an applause to June Chihiro for speaking on the panel, and Pravini. After the song of Chihiro, we'll have the one-on-one interview with Loki, our guest from London, and then all three of you will return to the panel for a Q&A session with the audience. Let's give Chihiro the space to do her song and give her an applause.
Joining us on stage, the amazing people from Afrogrooves. And so, what do I need to say about this song? I think one thing that this song was made for the movement. So we intentionally put in like a gang chorus where everybody shouts along. It kind of needs a megaphone, but I think tonight you'll be the megaphone. And for our video clip, we also consciously didn't put in ourselves, like Florian and me. We showed pictures and videos of tens of different protests, of shutdown, of occupations of Shell refineries, from Philippines to Seattle, from Argentina to UK. And I think that's really important, that we see these images, that resistance is possible, and that we can shut them down. And they will fall. It's just a matter of when, and we'll be here to applaud and make it happen. Okay, let's go.
Do you remember 300,000 Ogoni people on the streets, 93, to end the ecological war waged by the corporate greed? 3,000 oil spills, no reparation. Then came the military. Crops were destroyed and petrodollars, but killing the police. We blocked the street, shut down their industry. Oh, can you hear our call? Shell must fall. Oh, Shell must fall. Ogoni people not forgotten, Shell must fall. They raped and tortured and murdered for oil. Ogoni people not forgotten, Shell must fall.
Just 3 miles from indigenous land sits a toxic waste pool. Heavy metals, radioactive trash. Fracking dumps are lethal. With 2 spills a day, you know you can. How can they still operate? Mapuche people file a legal case. How long must they wait? We block the streets, shut down their industry. Oh, can you hear our call? Shell must fall. Oh, Shell must fall. It's not forgotten, Shell must fall. They poison the water, threaten health of all. Mapuche people not forgotten, Shell must fall. In the 60s, it was predicted that it would make the land shake. Now 60 years later, extraction has caused over 1,000 earthquakes. They tore the land, cracks in the homes, and in the people too. Still democracy straight to the city protects the fossil fuel. We block the street, demand accountability. Oh, can you hear our call? Shell must fall. Oh, Shell must fall.
fall. Shell must fall. Oh, Shell must fall. Human rights are violated. Shell must fall. Shell must fall. Oh, Shell must fall. Climate crimes around the world. Oh, Shell must fall. 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 Everyone, Shell must fall. That's your order. Shell must fall. 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 Our goal is clear and we are unstoppable. 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 Our goal is clear and we are unstoppable.
Chihiro! Supported by Afro Grooves. Give it up, give it up. Shell must fall. Our guest from London, Loki. Welcome, London.
Thank
From
you.
London, Loki.
1 2 1 2
شكو معكم؟
كل شيء تمام شلونك انت؟
الحمد لله بخير.
all good all good
أمورك أحوالك؟
يعني نص نص بس
نص
أنا
نص.
أريد أشرح لك شيء. I just have to respond to one of the questions that you just asked.
Go for it.
So the question was, isn't this the mainstream? This idea that we are heading to a place of permanent instability where organized human life as we know it is not going to be possible because of the extraction basis of our economic system. Isn't that the mainstream? Well, it might appear so if we look at the news channels and we look at the public statements of politicians. But globally, still to this day, fossil fuel companies receive $5.5 trillion yearly of all governments combined of subsidies. Some of the worst offenders are the United States. It's $650 billion per year in subsidies to fossil fuel companies. If you then compare that to the percentage of the US annual budget, which is spent on environmental protection, is 0.2% of its annual budget. If we look at Britain, which is also a massive subsidizer of fossil fuel companies, it's only 0.13% of the government's yearly budget that goes on environmental protection. And even if we look at it in an even more interesting way, we see that the world's biggest banks, like JP Morgan, like Citibank, they are all invested in the most harmful fossil fuel extraction. And even when we look at the music aspect of it, almost 90% of the world's music that is heard is owned by 3 companies: Sony, Warner, and Universal. Well, who owns Sony? Citibank and JP Morgan. Obviously, Sony are also responsible for a large percentage of all the films that come out of Hollywood. The US's number 2 biggest export, number 2 only to weapons, which is the other major cause of climate change. The institution which causes the most climate change in the world is the US military. Now, the majority of people in this room either live in or originate in countries that house the US military, right or wrong. We are at a time where actually the amount of funds that goes to the US military is more than the next 7 countries combined. So actually, it's completely the opposite of being the mainstream. And moreover, even if you look at the history of the movements that have tried to force this change within the system, in the UK, you had, over the last 30 to 40 years, 1,000 different political groups infiltrated by the police, and a large percentage of them were climate groups specifically. Moreover, when you look at the amount of people that go from the security state of the British government into companies like Shell and BP, the revolving door actually numbers in the hundreds. We're talking about people that directly go back and forth between these organizations. So quite the opposite is true. What we also have to be aware of, though, is in the Green New Deal, which is being put forward by the Biden administration, you have a clear reliance on the extraction of lithium, and 50% of carbon emissions come from extraction. Moreover, when we're in a situation where our regulations have been so worn down over these years, and one of the key ways in which climate change is due to be dealt with is by insulating homes to lower carbon emissions, well, these very regulations that are supposedly policing these companies and what they're putting on the buildings are often written by the companies themselves as experts. And we have seen the human cost of that in the neighborhood that I live in, with the fire at Grenfell, which some of you may have heard of, but this was a situation where in the name of the Kyoto Agreement, insulation was put on a block of flats to lower carbon emissions, and this material was flammable, and it led to the death of 72 of my neighbors, among them one of my good friends and his family. So these are the things that we have to be aware of. Keep our eyes on the numbers, keep our eyes on the tax filings, keep our eyes on where the funding is going, and really not put so much emphasis on the public pronunciations of political figures.
And he's just warming up. So I was intending to welcome you first and say we're very happy to have you here in Amsterdam, and also honored that I have the chance to speak to you.
It's my honor, bro.
We spoke in Iraqi Arabic dialect. I'm from Iraq. So is he, at least to an extent, but he's a poet, so I won't say too much about that, because you never know when you say something wrong and then they can say it better. So let's, if you don't mind, I'll run my mini Hollywood script, starting with your early interaction with rap and rap music. I think you were about 11 when you were doing your first experiments with rapping?
12.
12.
But yeah, not far.
I told you. Take us back to that time. How did your musical environment look like then?
Well, I think, you know, I did grow up in a home that was exposed to Public Enemy, Gil Scott-Heron, but generally I think that my communication with hip-hop music was really a form of cultural imperialism, because you have to remember that Britain is a country that has around 105 US military installations in it. Culturally, it very much is looking towards the United States as a role model in many different ways. And one of the sort of dialectic processes that played out, as also did for the Beatles, not that I would ever in a million years compare myself to the Beatles, but you have to remember that the Beatles came from Liverpool at a time where something like £75,000 a day was being poured into Liverpool's economy by the presence of US military bases around it. The type of records that they were listening to were often gleaned from US soldiers on the bases. The performances that the Beatles were giving were attended by US soldiers who would come in and out of Liverpool. However, and here's the point where it contradicts, and you can hear it in their music. Later on, you get Paul McCartney talking against the idea of nuclear weapons. Later on, you get John Lennon not only coming out against the Vietnam War, but funding the Black Panthers and the IRA. You have an alternative ending to this story. And, you know, the Philippines is an interesting example, because the United States military in the Philippines did not create the types of economies that they created in Japan, for example. In Japan, because of the Korean War, which killed millions, because of the Vietnam War, and a lot of the materials that the United States were using, it was easier for them to get it from Japanese vendors within Japan than to import it all the way to Asia and then use it on the Vietnamese or the Korean. So what developed was really the seeds of the US's own deindustrialization and the rise of economic powers like Japan, whereas the Philippines did not play out in that way, obviously. And in Britain, as I was saying, we were deeply, intensely influenced by the United States, to the extent that when we first started rapping, all of us would rap in American accents or some sort of estimation of what an American accent would be.
And what were the subjects?
The subjects sometimes were things that related to things that were happening with us, but then obviously, as I'm sure you relate to also, the war on terror, I think, reconfigured our ideas around race within British society. You know, you have to remember that the idea of race being a biological reality is clearly argued by all geneticists to not be reflective of any actual truth. It's a social construction which is given a kind of a biological explanation. Well, what makes sense for us in Britain, the way that the war on terror played out, is it played out with intensified surveillance of people racialized by the state as Muslims. It played out as the suspension of Magna Carta, the Magna Carta habeas corpus, you know, that supposed core column of what it means to be British. You will have politicians pontificate about the importance of the Magna Carta. However, right now, today, in Britain, you have a situation where a young child in a school could be learning about the Magna Carta, but simultaneous to that, they could have a member of their family who'd be detained without trial, without seeing the evidence held against them, and without being judged by a jury of their peers. Clearly, habeas corpus is suspended, and there is essentially a hierarchy of political subjectivity, which is one of the effects of the war on terror. And that child also can be questioned by police without the presence of their parents or even knowledge of their parents, purely upon the basis of things they say in school because of the PREVENT program. So these are the ways that essentially, you know, it's like Malcolm X said, you know, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. We didn't cross the border crossed us. We were politicized by the context. We didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, well, you know, I've decided I just want to be a political person. No, politics defined where we lived. It defined how we lived. It defined who we lived with. It defined the registers in which we spoke in different places that we were. It defined the types of jobs we did. It defined all of those things. And political activism for people in communities which are subject to, you know, prior to Grenfell, and this is the thing that has been left out of the story about this building, this great spectacle of this building that burnt. Prior to the building being burnt, all of us in the community understood that our blocks were due to be knocked down. The only building that we thought wasn't going to be knocked down was Grenfell Tower. And the reason that the buildings were going to be knocked down is more expensive properties were going to be built in their place. Grenfell was the exception purely because of the refurbishment that had taken place and this cladding that had been put on it. So the twisted irony of the story is that the very thing which we thought kept them safe was the very thing that killed them. And the very reason that all of us are still in the buildings we're in today is because Grenfell burnt down and the local government, the council, backed off. So this is the point. Politics comes to us. And so for me, while I was, you know, mimicking this thing that I saw happening in the United States, these people that had been marketed to me for a very long time, I also found in it the ways and the strands through which I could relate to other people and through which I could then speak to people and communicate to people in a very, very large and sort of wide sweeping way.
On this topic, let me check. Does anyone remember the airplane accident in Amsterdam Zuidoost? By a show of hands? Okay, those who don't remember? and it happened very close here. So this was an accident located, I'm not sure if you're aware, where I believe it were airplanes from El Al, the Israeli airliner, flew into towers in a disenfranchised area. And it was also under very dubious circumstances, and most likely traces of chemical materials were found that are used for weaponry, but of course, this was hidden from media. So this reality, I think from being from Amsterdam, we can relate to. Let me get to that. Very interesting that you talk about how the war on terror, supposedly, what they call, how that politicized, how that caused the change in your life, and I think many lives of people of our generation. You wrote a song about it. Allow me to quote you. They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this: I'm all about peace and love. That's the melody. What I want to connect to is that in the very same song, you also say, let me just look it up. I just had it. Lumumba was democracy, Mossadegh was democracy, Allende was democracy, hypocrisy, it bothers me, call you a terrorist if you don't want to be a colony. A very interesting theme in your work is the connection between race and identity politics, which happens here, and to a great extent somewhere else as well, and colonialism, imperialism, war, the destruction of the third world. You're a man of ideas. Can you explain that to us?
I mean, well, it's quite simple. The project that I mentioned in Britain that ended up spying on 1,000 different political groups was something called the Special Demonstration Squad. And it was set up actually during the United States' most costly, not only in human resources, but in material resources, year of the Vietnam War, 1968. You had massive demonstration outside the US Embassy in Britain to prevent Britain joining the Vietnam War. And off the back of it, the British government, in an expression of their servility, put aside the funding to infiltrate all of these political groups in order to prove themselves to the United States. For the US to have 1,000 military bases across the world, for the United States to have that as a status quo and to have that access, which, by the way, is not just about projections of political power, it's also about guaranteeing the passage of goods across the world, because those military bases work on making sure those goods are moving around. The whole global economy really is based on this network of US bases. But that in and of itself is a status quo which is opposed by huge swaths of humanity. In order for that to be imposed, what you must have is systems of relative democratic expression, whereby the political parameters are very carefully managed. So, you know, whether it's Italy, whether it's Gough Whitlam in Australia, whether it's Lumumba in the Congo, there have been many different political movements that have found themselves on the wrong side of the CIA, which acted in concert with other NATO intelligence agencies. You know, the British were even involved in what happened in the Congo. I mean, anyone that knows the history of Britain occupying 14 million miles of the globe, it's not really a surprise. But the point is that in order for that to happen, you need that form of domination to take place. You need that form of power to be exercised on people. And when we compare it to the threat inflation of what we talk about in terms of political violence, because essentially terrorism is a form of political violence. But in the British context, you have a 1 in 16 chance of being anywhere near an act of political violence. Professor Frank Harvey from the United States makes the argument that you're 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning, that you're more likely to be shot in the United States by a toddler with a handgun. Let's not forget that there's 200 guns for every person in the United States. In Britain, for example, over the last 10 years, prior to the pandemic, you had an estimation by Danny Dorling at Oxford University that 130,000 people had died because of austerity. That is the cutting of funds to health services, to social services, to important public institutions that administer life to the population, that have a duty of care to the population. Therefore, statistically, statistically, you are more likely to die in Britain from austerity than you are to die from terrorism. You are more likely to be killed by decisions and signatures which are put on paper by people who have public respectability than you are to be killed by a poor, disillusioned, misguided young man. And let's not forget, there has been, especially in the case of the British, examples of them using disillusioned young men and sending them around the world to act as mercenaries for British foreign policy. Mark Curtis goes into it in depth in the book Secret Affairs. So all I was asking for with that song was a level of criticality in thinking about the ways that we understand public risk and threat inflation specifically, and then thinking about the ways that those sort of pious hypocrisies manifest into people's lives. And people are made to answer for things which actually they're far more likely to be victims of. Only 0.5% of all terror attacks happen in quote-unquote Western countries. The vast majority of them happen in countries like Pakistan, like Iraq, like Syria, like Nigeria. So as Iraqis, we're far more likely than anyone else in the room to be victims of terrorism. But also as Iraqis, we're far more likely than many in the room to be considered potential terrorists. So it's that core contradiction and hypocrisy that I attempt to address in the song.
In your song, Dear England, my last question, are you summarizing what you just said by saying if a policeman can kill a black man where he found him, a soldier can kill an Afghan in the mountains?
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously Britain is a country that's occupied Afghanistan 4 times in the last 2 centuries. It made the Durand Line, which separates Afghanistan from Pakistan, which split up the Pashtun community in what was at that time India and Afghanistan today. In many ways, Britain laid the fault lines for many different conflicts that have taken place across the world, and often, you know, as the world's second largest arms supplier. Let's not forget, look at the size of England. England industrialized through the commodification of human beings. Britain became the world's #1 economy through colonialism. And this is a simple, basic fact of history, that within Britain, we have to fight so hard just to assert that tiny, small element of British history. This aversion to understanding how this place, which low in natural resources, if you understand Britain as being, you know, the Britain that it seems to be today, if you discount the fact that it has a network of tax havens which account for 37% of all of tax losses for governments around the world, if we accept Britain as what they claim it is today, is limited in terms of human resources, in terms of space, in terms of national resources, and no one turns around and asks, how did we end up taking the GDP and increasing it by 300% over about 100 years and still managing to keep it that a labourer in Bethnal Green in the late 1800s in East London, their life expectancy was still 16 years old? How do we explain that history? So that particular song is an attempt to really to speak to really a group of people who are being purposely and actively miseducated by our curriculums in Britain.
Thanks a lot, Loki, so far. After our next guest, whom I'll introduce shortly, we'll have a continuation of this conversation with Loki and the other artists whom you've just seen. Let's give him a preliminary applause. So our next guest is a man whom I also happen to know personally, and I'm quite sure if you've met him, you probably remember exactly when and how you met him for the first time. When I met him for the first time, I went to a place, it was dark and small, not very far from here. I knocked on the door, a man opened with black hair, a little longer than mine, small, very friendly eyes that speak to you. And I was going to a storytelling event, but it didn't look like that. So I told him, "Are you the storyteller?" He said, "Maybe you are." Sahan Sahib Divani. No, come on, a bit louder, come on. A bit louder, a bit louder.
I am a newborn dad of 2 5-month-olds. 2 daughters, half Thank you. They're being applauded for being. This is beautiful. I will pass it on to them when I see them tonight. They are half Arab, half Persian. They are half from the mountains, half from the sea. They are half from Iran, half from Palestine. Again, they're being applauded simply for being. Wonderful. We artists work our asses off an entire lifetime, and they're just born, and it's amazing. So stop spoiling them, please. I want them to suffer to become real artists. 1. The nurse told me that babies dream, and I was skeptical because I had no idea what it is that a 2-day-old baby will dream of. What have they experienced? What do they know of life? What has the brain experienced that it needs to process, that it needs to dream of? I am skeptical until I take my daughters home, and then when they're 4 days old, suddenly there's a shriek in the living room. I run towards my eldest. I call her the eldest because she has 2 minutes more than the youngest. And she's fine. She's absolutely fine. There is nothing happening. She has simply woken up from a dream. She has woken up from sleep. She has dreamt of something. And I realized that nurse was right. I realized that this baby girl already dreams of things that she's experienced. And of course, she's been in a belly for 9 months. It's something that she remembers. And I realized we all remembered once upon a time when we were in that belly and we felt it. We felt that safety. We felt that world that was mother. We felt that sea, that endless sea. And I realized that if we remembered, a moment comes when we forget, right? Because obviously most of us, I'm assuming, I'm going out on a limb, most of you do not remember being in that belly. I don't. If you do, maybe you do, I don't know. I might call you a liar, but let's assume none of you do, okay? Now, I have 2 daughters, so theoretically it is possible that one of my daughters at some point in her life will still remember while the other one has forgotten. And my daughters, 5 months old, they do not speak my language. They do not say Baba, but they're twins, so they have their own language. And it's a language of gurgling, it's a language of farts, it's a language of squeaking and squealing, it's a language of looking at each other and averting their eyes, and they are fluent. And I assume that one of them is having a conversation with the other saying, do you remember the before time? And the other one answers, what before time? The before time, when we were in that other place. What other place? What do you mean, what other place? You think we were just thrown into this world, perfect, with 10 fingers and 10 toes and loving parents? Well, that's how our parents treat us. Don't you remember the rushing, the sound in your ears, the coming and the going and the coming and the going? Ah, of course, says the other one. The sea, I remember the sea. No, you idiot. We haven't seen the sea yet. You're remembering things backwards. That's the other place. Yes, I remember the sea. I remember the whooshing and the endless waves, and I remember the horizon, and I remember just lying there on that sea, going towards the horizon to disappear in this one dot on that edge between being and not being, this one dot which is my heartbeat. 2. My father carries around a beautiful picture of my mother, and he carries it to the places where revolutionaries meet. Now, you have to imagine Iranian revolutionaries, they're a sorry lot. They're revolutionaries who have lost their revolution. They are gathering in little community centers in Amsterdam, and they talk about diabetes medication, and they're talking about the cost of parking, and they're talking about social housing, and they're talking about whatever revolutionaries talk about who've lost their revolution. And there is my father, and there is my mother, and my mother doesn't quite understand why they are there. Some of the revolutionaries come and speak to my mother, and my mother's eyes wander off, and she doesn't understand the words, and she has no patience for people, but there is cake, and she loves cake. And my father has this picture of her, which is a picture that his brother-in-law took in the Museum of Resistance in Iran. And it's a picture of my mother, of his wife, of this sister of the revolution. It's her as a young revolutionary, 23 years old, 6 months married to my father, locked up in a prison in Iran. It has her name, it has her number, it has a scarf photoshopped over her head, because in our minds today in Iran, we cannot imagine that once upon a time there were people fighting revolutions without headscarves. It doesn't matter. My father loves this picture, and he shows it to all the other revolutionaries. He has lost his revolution, but there is one last fight he must fight, and it's a fight that doesn't have an end. It's the fight that tells the revolutionaries that this sister, she used to matter, and if she mattered then, she still matters today. And she sits my mother down. He pushes away the plate with the cake and has her be quiet for a moment so that he can tell of her exploits back in the day. And he entertains all of them. You know that this sister packed a gun in the days of the revolution. And I said, you have to be at home because you're carrying our child. Your womb needs to be a safe place. And my mother said, safe place. With this gun, I will make it a safe place. And the revolutionaries laughed, and they looked at the picture, and they looked at my mom, and they tried to make both one. And it's almost impossible, but sometimes it is. Sometimes it is possible. 3, my wife has decided that our daughters will go to Palestine. Now, they need to have an Israeli passport. My wife is insistent that they will have an Israeli passport because no bureaucracy will stand in the way of my daughters reconnecting to the land of their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. But for them to get a passport means they will have a passport which does not have my name, because I come from a land which is at war with the land that has to issue the papers. And suddenly, my daughters are identified by 2 conflicting sets of papers. And in one, they have a Persian name, and in the other, they have an Arab name, and in the other, I do not exist. But it allows them to travel. And I see them go. And when I jump through the hoops of bureaucracy, a week later, I follow them and I reach the sea, which is the sea of their ancestors. And it's the sea that they were meant to meet. It's the sea where their grandmother, the mother of their mother, lives. And I brought the thing that I promised my wife to bring. It is that little piece of them. It is the umbilical cords that we kept. The mother of my mother says, here in Palestine, in Akka, we have a tradition. We take the umbilical cords and we throw them into the sea. We ask for a blessing. We ask for safety. We ask for anyone who goes to return in peace, and that's what we do. I look at my daughters. I take the hand of my wife. I walk to the edge of the water. I walk further and let the water come to my legs and to my knees, and then I throw them. Whoom! One for my daughter, and then she throws, boom, the other for the other. 4, we're back in Amsterdam. My daughters, who are half Palestinian, half Iranian, they go to Palestine. They don't go to Iran. We're back in Amsterdam because I don't go to Iran. We've been to the sea. We've thrown the umbilical cords. I want them to go to the mountains. I can't go to the mountains. I can't take them. I can't scoop them up and have them walk down the memories that I have, the stories that were passed down. I sit in my apartment in Amsterdam, and there is my wife, and there is my daughters, and there is my father, and there is my mother, the revolutionary who has forgotten her revolution, who looks at these kids and doesn't quite understand who they are. And I'm thinking, what's the use of fighting a revolution if you don't even recognize your grandchildren as your own? And I push away this thought, like my father pushes away the cake, because it's not the first time that I've thought it, and it's not the first time that I've tried to introduce my daughters to my mother, who are as much hers as they are of the other grandmother. But this time, a funny thing happens. Suddenly, she jumps up. And it's with a shriek. It's the same sound that my daughter made when she had her first nightmare. But then she walks to the crib. She points at the girls. She looks at both of them. She studies their faces, one face from the mountains, one face from the sea. She looks at me and suddenly says, one of them is yours. And I say, Mama John, both of them are mine and both of them are yours. And both of them belong to themselves. And no, she'll have nothing of that poetry. This is a woman who has very few words left. She repeats both of them, one of them, this one, or maybe this one. One of them is yours. And at that moment, it doesn't matter what she understands. I know what she feels, and it's something like beauty. It's something like solace. It's something like that trip I need to make. Bureaucracy be damned. When my mother, for the first time, holds one of the girls that she knows is mine. Revolution. Thank you.
Is he is he a magician, a poet, a revolutionary, a storyteller? He also plays music. I have no clue. Sahand Sahib Diwani, give him a hand. Loki, Chihiro, Pravini, and June join us on the stage one more time. Please take your seats. So it's time for you, the audience, to shine and ask your questions. Let's just make sure we don't trip. We will have lost a significant portion of the revolutionary population if that happens. Can we switch on this one as well? I think there's two there. And here's one more. So all right, that's cool. All right. So let's kick off. Raise your hand if you have a question. There's one here. Let's just start with that. Did we think about microphones for audience? We didn't, right? So just, shout. Don't hurt your voice, though. Go for it. What's your name?
Abriel, what did you learn in school about, you mentioned low-key in passing, but it's actually a question for all of you. What were you told in school about colonialism, revolution, the story of the country you grew up in?
Yeah, I will. So what did you learn in school about colonialism? I'll take just two, if that's all right. So I have more space for questions from the audience. Pravini?
Yeah, I can be short, nothing. Yeah, I think that's the short answer. I think for me, most interesting is, what didn't I learn about my own heritage? Because that is also tied to colonialism. And for me, I had to go outside of the school system to understand where I came from, to understand what Indo-Caribbean means, to understand what indentured labor meant in relation to slavery, etc. So there are a lot of stories that were not even part of the educational system at all. So nothing.
Did they even say there was indentured
No.
students or no?
No.
There's, in fact, counter-propaganda included in education. So even if you encounter this idea, you have some background that tells you it's not true. But I'll leave it to Chihiro.
My mic doesn't work.
Can you use Pravini's?
Yeah, so I get in line, nothing. I think there was a lot in history just about Second World War and a very limited scope on what is treated in the Second World War, because we don't learn what happened in Indonesia. We don't learn what happened in many places around the world. But the Second World War was on a loop. And that's definitely, I'm now giving workshops and I'm treating colonial aphasia. Aphasia is a term that talks about the inability to communicate something. And I think in our school, we're actually being taught the inability to even talk about colonialism. So yeah, I have to teach about, the genocides of so many people.
When you say you have to teach, are you... You didn't tell us.
I'm a trainer also. So
Right, okay.
Just now, this week I was giving a training in the Stedelijk Museum to tour guides for a new exhibition coming up about Kirchner Nolde, expressionists from Germany, that also went to, or Nolde went to Papua New Guinea. And so his art is being celebrated while nobody knows any Papuan New Guinea artists, and there's a lot of cultural appropriation happening there. So the aphasia, the inability, I think that's a huge one, because we don't even know the word aphasia, let alone how to treat it.
Brilliant. Thanks for keeping it short, so we have more space for questions from the room. Raise your hand if you have one. In the back, it's very dark, so keep your hand up a little longer. Let me just switch to the back where I can see one hand going up. Please stand up if you can. Tell us your name and shout your question.
My name is Daryl. What is your stance on armed resistance?
All right, let's not get in trouble. Okay, June, and then Loki.
I get the nice question.
was
It's
just a
the right
coincidence.
of every nation, of every people, to rise up against occupation, against a government that is not serving its people. It should be recognized, but unfortunately, in the world that we are in, if you're a people that rise up and take up arms, you could be labeled as terrorists, like what happens in the Philippines. We have a civil war that has been going on for 50 years, and the United States declared that movement as a terrorist movement, and the Netherlands, 24 hours after that declaration, recognized that declaration and puts the organizations that have been leading the revolution as a terrorist and as a terrorist. So now we are campaigning in Europe and in the world for the delisting of the organizations in our country that are leading that revolution.
Loki.
There is. Can you hear me? Is it on? Yeah.
No, can you use Chihiro's?
1, 2. Okay, so there's at least 2 UN resolutions which have been passed that state clearly that a group of people who are subject to a foreign occupation have the right to liberate themselves, and this is the words of one of those resolutions, not mine, to liberate themselves through armed resistance. When you look at human history, it's a story of, it's a mixed bag. It says that you need negotiation alongside something that can prevent domination of your society. I mean, there's also the use, I feel, in non-violence and in interrupting the passages of power through conscientious objection and through, it's not non-violence as a conviction, it's as a tactic alongside other ways of resisting domination by foreign powers. But anyone would say that. There's no one in the world that would say that armed resistance, and anyone that would say that armed resistance has no place, is not being honest. They're being disingenuous, I would say.
Thanks. More questions from the room. And yes, go for it.
I just wanted to add a movie tip with Lauryn Hill concerning violence. It's this Wretched of the Earth parts that are being read, and in this panel, I think we need to flag that as homework for the movement.
Brilliant. There's a question in the front. Yeah.
Does any of the panel believe in boycotting commercial consumption goods as a form of resistance?
Maybe I'll switch to Loki. You're quite active in the Palestine movement.
No, I'm
and that's
happy.
one of the tactics, right?
Yeah, absolutely. BDS is an important component, and
The boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel.
Yeah, alongside many different other things, at the same time, and often culture goes places where politics follows. So at the time where Bruce Springsteen and others made Sun City, when the Specials made Free Nelson Mandela, at that time it was illegal to even hold up a picture of Nelson Mandela in public. At the same time you had people who are, David Cameron,
Kill Mandela.
Part of a campaign at his university calling for the execution of Nelson Mandela. And now today, the way that history has turned, you have a statue of Nelson Mandela outside Parliament. But also, you look at the suffragettes. It was 300 years that people in Britain had to militate, people that weren't landed gentry, that didn't own property, to have the right to vote for parliamentary representation. It was 300 years. The suffragettes attempted to push Winston Churchill under a train. They threw bricks through 10 Downing Street, okay? So anyone here who talks about this idea of, violence is a terrible thing, nobody should do it, well, how were the rights of women to vote in Britain won? They were won through, largely it was coming out of World War I, that Britain was really forced to make these concessions also because they didn't want their populations becoming socialists also. That was another key part of it, is that there was now this other column of a alternative that Britain needed to give some form of concession to people in order to avoid that happening.
Okay.
So, yeah.
One of the other three panelists, returning to the questions, boycotting certain commercial produce as a tactic.
I can respond. Yes. All right. Thank you. Yeah, I think there are many ways to resist. I think that's important to keep in mind. There's not one right way to resist. I think there are many ways, and I think there are many people who have different needs in that sense, who want to contribute, and not everyone is able to go out on the streets because of many different reasons. So to have all these different ways of contributing to the movement, I feel that boycott is one of those ways.
Brilliant. Thanks. A question in the front.
It was particularly for June about the Philippines, because I think
Go for it.
It's a new subject for everyone. How can people in the Netherlands or internationally support the struggle of the Filipino people?
Before you answer, June, if you have a question, please put your hands up after this answer.
Okay. For the longest time, we've been trying to raise international support for the struggle in the Philippines. But right now, there's a new organization that has come up, and it's called Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle. And this is one contact information that you should consider if you want to support the people in struggle against imperialism, bureaucrat capitalism, against feudalism. This is a flashpoint in revolution that is going face to face and toe to toe with against American imperialism. So it's Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle. You can look it up in the internet. And I think Tom, you have contact with that? Yes, we can refer you to that. And we really ask, we challenge, and we appeal for the support of the international community for the struggle of the people in the Philippines.
Brilliant. Are there questions in the back? That's one hand. Yes, go ahead.
This is more of a personal question for June, if he is willing to share. I'm assuming you spent a significant portion of your life in the Philippines?
Sorry?
I assume you spent a significant portion of your life in the Philippines.
Yes.
So when you moved here to the Netherlands, was there a culture shock at how different it was from the life that you have back in the Philippines?
Did you have a culture shock when you arrived in the Netherlands, and how different was it?
Yes, coming from a very poor, backward country, mostly rural, then you come to Europe and it's all city, it's all asphalt, cement, and glass. Really, I felt discrimination, I felt racism. I saw that many of the oppressions that we are experiencing in the Philippines are also happening here, but not on the same scale. And I saw privilege being flaunted around and at the expense of the colored people. But I also saw a lot of warm hearts that welcomed me when I came here as a refugee in 2003. I got welcoming support, financial support, homes were offered, and I think there's a big space to gather international support for struggles coming from abroad in the Netherlands. But also in the same light, I think there should be some effort in organizing the working people here in the Netherlands towards really significant social change and not just for cosmetic changes in
Symbolic
their
changes.
lifestyles.
All right, I think we have space for one more question, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, let's do 2 questions because I see 2 hands. Am I right? Yes? And try to keep it super short, if that's all right. You go first.
I was wondering which sources of information you find reliable and which ones you don't, and how you stay informed about everything that's happening.
All right, brilliant. That's one.
Yeah, my question was also mainly for June, because again, firstly I want to say what a lovely panel of artists. Like, it's really nice to see you all here. What is the one lesson from the movement, the 50-year movement in the Philippines that has been developed and reflected upon, and like that you think that we can learn from here in the Netherlands? And I just want to add one thing. Like, I recommend, and maybe we can organize this year, Ocean Selfie is a movie about the Filipino armed struggle, and it's amazing. And since, if you want to know about armed struggle, it's a great movie to watch, and maybe we can do a screening here. But yes, back to what is the biggest lesson in these years?
I think it's a clarity of vision of what kind of society you want to achieve. We want to achieve a truly democratic society where the majority, where the rights and welfares of the majority are taken into account. And you cannot do that by coalition or collaboration with the ruling powers, with the elite that has oppressed you. It's important that you recognize that you need to establish your version of the government, your own government. Sure, really, seizure of political power is important so that you can establish the democracy that you are trying to achieve, the democracy of the majority of the people compared to the democracy of the elite.
Brilliant. Sources of information, other panelists.
I love to hear your sources.
Go for it.
Which one? I guess it would depend where you would want that information. Obviously, when it comes to the Netherlands, everyone in this room would know far better than me where the good places to get information would be. In terms of if you're interested in the British side of things, there's an organization that I work with called Declassified, which I think is a great source of information. There's another one called Ceasefire, which I think is a good one. There's Counterfire, which is a good one. If you're talking about the United States, I think The Real News is a good one, or Democracy Now! Is a good one too. Those are just some that maybe I could suggest.
I think for me, I tend to read books. And
so old-fashioned.
And no, there's a reason for it, because the news is very much prone to the hurry culture of white supremacy culture. And in hurry culture, it is easier to be misled. In books, there are falsehoods as well, but you pick up a pattern. You pick up a pattern of a writer, and even if you read a book that is bumping up against your ideology or your way of understanding the world, you can still learn by reading between the lines or even hacking their logics. So for me, I'm a book binger, and also I watch a lot of what do you call it, like lectures on YouTube by a lot of indigenous
speakers,
indigenous artists and academics, activists. And I think also take the time, whoever it is that you kind of are learning from their brain or from their lives, take the time to learn deeper, to not just watch one talk, but watch all of the talks, just be diligent. I think this helps to deepen our commitment as well, of like what we do, let's do it well, and not be in a rush.
Yeah, I actually have 2 approaches. So one is, in addition to what has already been said, to actually follow people that you find inspiring in terms of, you know, their political ideas, because they tend to share sources that I didn't think of. So I kind of learn through their sources. And second, I try to also look at the mainstream and the other sources to find out the gaps, and that helps me in my analysis to analyze, where the gaps lie, and if we have conversations, to point out those gaps with the analysis of the other sources. So I always try to, check a variety of sources to kind of, form my own opinion and analysis.
A very, very warm applause of gratitude and inspiration for June, Pravini, Chihiro, and Loki. We'll now have a piece of spoken word, followed by a break, and then we'll return to the main musical program, which will be with Loki and Afro Grooves. Chris, all yours. You guys can, if you want, take your seat back in the audience. All right. So, Chris, I'm not sure how to introduce you, bro. Author, activist. By the way, activist like a real organizer activist. The guys who open the rooms, get the money. I don't know how they do it. And then organize events. And also a spoken word artist I discovered today. Give him an applause.
Thanks, Ali, for introducing me, and it's so good to be here. Like it's one big family. All the speakers, and a lot of people in the audience, familiar faces. Those I don't know, I'm sure you're very beautiful and committed people. So I'm really, really happy to have you here, yeah, warm welcome in that regard. The piece I'm doing now. The reason Ali is a good friend of mine, and the reason he doesn't know I'm a spoken word artist, is because I actually haven't done any spoken word in a long, long time. And the piece I'm doing for you now, the last time I did it is about 6 years ago, and it was in an occupied building, the Maagdhuis, which was the headquarters. Yeah, we have two old comrades over there who were part of that occupation. We occupied the headquarters of the University of Amsterdam. For like 6 weeks. And on the second day, we had a packed building, 400 people, and I did this spoken word, which I had just written. And, well, I don't know how old I was, like 19 or something. And I was struggling at the time with health issues for quite a while already, like 1 or 2 years. And for me, this was kind of my processing about how to deal with, at the same time, having low energy, being able to do very little, but still feeling committed to the struggle and doing what you can do. And the reason I'm doing this today is because actually those health struggles, I didn't realize back then, but that was just the beginning. I had my last surgery, hopefully the last, I think it's the last, just a few months ago. So yeah, for me this is a bit of a journey, and I was actually getting a bit emotional just sitting there and thinking about that. But yeah, so that's the background story. I won't tell you anymore, and I'll just get going. So yeah, you take it off. Sometimes I wonder whether I need to see life as a test, a game, or a piece within the bigger picture. Whether I feel the need to flower the fold, to figure the difference between realness and fiction. A thin line seems to be the only string to hold on to within this broken system, this vision society pressures upon our children. By all means, the media fuels the mainstream, but to keep your feet on the ground is to abandon no fish, but to listen to the voices above, aside or below. Where you choose to look is inferior to looking itself out of the box. Substitution for prison. Distraction has risen, the road has been given, but Rome isn't reached. But my turmoil taints my allowance to preach. She was a lively child that made me smile in the streets, a dreamer of the degree, feeling It's been a long day organizing all this, so my brain is a bit fried. We'll go on. dreamer of the grief floating over and above the walls of conformity. But the social norms narrowed with age, locked up in a cage, I stared at the bars manifesting itself through the teachers of the mind and the holders of my heart. I needed answers for my future and questions as of now, so I sought them out in the slums of Tamil Nadu in the great mountains of Annapurna. Paid for by 70-hour work weeks, 4 jobs for 8 months, and all I got was disease. 6 months in bed, and I still struggle with post-viral fatigue, and questions still define my identity, but I spent my spare energy digging through declassified files so my eyes will bleed while the hands of the clock are strangling me. So how dare I preach to my blissfully ignorant fellow human being? But then sometimes I listen to those voices above, aside and below, and lo and behold, those question marks got deeper as a scar on the skins of the mothers of the desaparecidos in Argentina, Guatemala, El Salvador. Generals and dictators trained on American soil for oil and armed with European weapons for water, while the daughters will die of thirst caused by the droughts that bestow the earth for our hoarding of fucking stuff. I caught a recording revealing the nature of our war in Iraq. We dropped depleted uranium in Fallujah, a people more genetically wrecked than the sons of Hiroshima, and I know my genes are still intact. As a matter of fact, I feel my heart strengthen with each word I write, and I know now that I first failed to realize that you and I cannot lose, only choose not to be a pawn in this game. There are millions fighting against feminine disease for the greed of a few, but don't you be fooled, because there's enough food to feed over 10 billion people. It's just time to return the land, to take the war machine down, and to burn every single fossil industry to the ground. And then I'll say, I'll have withstood my test, and then I'll fly, and you will join me, so that we can be a piece of a new, beautiful world.
So that's Chris, ladies and gentlemen. Give it up, give it up, give it up. So I never knew he had some health struggles then, but he was actually literally digging through declassified files. I have to tell them this. He wrote a book about Ukraine. You know, at the time when there was this whole thing about Ukraine and the West was fighting for human rights in Ukraine against the Russians because they're evil, he wrote a book about that, and it was endorsed by some leading Ukraine experts, entirely ignored by the media because he happened to have the wrong opinion, as you heard. Another applause for Chris and everyone else who participated.